Chapter 5 Daredevil Lindbergh Wine of the Gods. Days later, Charles teamed up with several pilots, including H.J. Cupid Lynch, and spent the next 4 months barnstorming above the golden fields of Kansas. The Badlands of Nebraska and the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. Barnstorming meant crisscrossing small-town America, dropping into county fairs and homecoming events, or using farmers as fields in hopes of selling 15-minute plane rides to country folks for $5 each. It meant luring customers by performing death-defying stunts, and for Charles it meant experiencing those brief but thrilling moments of anticipation mixed with dread as he walked on a plane's wing. With Lynch at the controls, the two barnstormers would swoop low over a town to attract attention. Then Charles crawled out of the open passenger cockpit. Inching his way along the wing, he felt courage and fear course through him. From the ground, folks could see the finger-width wires strung between the biplane's stacked wings as Charles gripped it to gain his balance, he looked like he was floating. Once he'd steadied himself, Lynch gained altitude. Higher and higher climbed the biplane before it finally turned back toward the crowd. Then, pulling back on the throttle, Lynch stopped the propeller blades with their 80-mile-an-hour blast of wind that could blow Charles off the wing. With the plane gliding on the air, Charles let go of the wire. Weaving between the struts near one of the bottom wings' end, he balanced on the narrow wooden spar that made up its spine, the only part of the structure strong enough to hold his weight. The wind screamed in his ears and buffeted his body. He wobbled, tottered, flailed, hundreds of feet above the ground, and without a parachute, he was truly defying death. If the plane hadn't remained level, or if a bird had flown into him, there was nothing Charles could have done. A feeling of exhilarated calm shot through him. He was at the wing's end now. He waved to the tense crowd below, then stretched out his arms and raised first his left foot, then his right foot. He bent at the waist as if tying his shoes. From afar it looked as if he were doing intricate balances. In reality, he was stepping into a pair of steel cups connected to the wing and attaching 4 cables too thin to be seen from the ground. He signaled to Lynch. The plane, which had been losing altitude all this time, started up with a roar. Once again, it rose higher into the sky. With the crowd gasping below, it looped the loop once, twice, three times before finally leveling out. Then, just as theatrically as Charles stood firm on the wing, he undid the cables and stepped out of the steel cups. After waving once more, he started back toward the cockpit, careful step by careful step. Once he'd climbed in, Lynch circled down for a landing. This stunt never failed to attract plenty of customers, now eager to pay for a plane ride. And even though he didn't gain any piloting experience, Charles never tired of the thrill. His every sense was sharpened, placing him on a higher level of existence. No longer was he one of the ordinary people below. His life was richer because of the danger, freer because he was not bound by earth. I tasted a wine of the gods. I decided that if I could fly for 10 years before I was killed in a crash, it would be a worthwhile trade for an ordinary life. A plane of his own. Southerfield in Georgia looked like a ghost city with its empty wooden barracks and neglected streets. Once it had been a bustling army base, but by the time Charles arrived in April 1923, it had been abandoned for years. Now just a handful of civilian mechanics worked in on one of the dozen hangars, reconditioning surplus planes. Word was they sold them cheap. Charles sure hoped so. He was desperate to buy his own plane. He knew it was the only way he'd ever gain any flying experience. But all he had was a few $100 in cash and cheeks. Some of it was savings from stunting. The rest he'd borrowed from his father. The mechanics gave him a good deal. For $500, every penny Charles had, he bought an Army surplus Curtiss JN-4D called a Jenny. Widely used during World War I to train beginning pilots, the Jenny was a twin-seat, two cockpits, Dual control, it could be flown from either cockpit. Student in front of instructor biplane. Light and maneuverable. It could do 70 miles an hour if the wind was favorable. Charles also chose a brand new Curtiss OX5 engine, a fresh coat of olive gray dope, and an extra 20-gallon fuel tank installed in the fuselage. Unable to afford a hotel, Charles lived on the field for the 2 weeks it took for his Jenny to be assembled and painted. At night he slept by its side in the hangar. At last the chief mechanic said, "Well, she's ready. When are you going to test her out?" That was when Charles realized it had been 6 months since he'd last been behind the controls of a plane. He'd had just 8 hours of stick time, and he'd never soloed. He was sweating all over as he climbed into the cockpit. He cautiously taxied across the field, bouncing, skidding, and fishtailing from side to side. As to his embarrassment, a group of pilots and mechanics gathered outside the hangar to gape and point. The plane rose into the air a few feet before thudding back to Earth. Rose and fell, rose and slammed back into the ground, and slammed back to the ground on one wheel. What an exhibition I'd made, recalled Charles. Sweaty and humiliated, he wished he could switch off his engine and stay right there in the middle of the field. But the mechanics would just drive out and ask what the trouble was. Red-faced, he turned and taxied slowly back toward the hangar. One of the pilots sauntered over to him. "Why don't you let me jump in the front of the cockpit before you try that again?" he asked. Charles's cheeks burned. He stammered out an excuse about rough air. Waving him off, the pilot climbed in. "Why don't we make a few rounds right now?" With the pilot's help, Charles taxied out onto the field again and rose into the air. It was easier to fly, he admitted, when someone was there to correct his mistakes. They made a half-dozen takeoffs and landings together. By late afternoon, Charles was ready to solo. It was, he admitted, far different from all other flights. You are completely independent and terribly alone in space. There's no hand to motion the nose down before a stall, no other head to check your fuel or watch your RPM. You can choose your point of compass and fly on as long as you like. I kept climbing that day, higher and higher. I might not have stopped climbing then, but the sun was almost touching earth, and dusk makes landing difficult for amateurs' eyes. Charles felt ready to make some money. For the next 5 months, and mostly alone, he barnstormed across the Midwest, and he gained valuable flying skills. He learned to read the weather and pick out safe landing places. He learned to steer a course using just a compass and landmarks below, and to do barrel rolls, spins, and dives. He slept in a canvas hammock hung from an upper wing, cooked canned beans over an open fire, and accumulated 250 hours of seat of the pants flying. On some days he barely earned back his expenses, while on others he carried passengers all day long for $5 each. This is sure a great life, he wrote his mother. He also made mistakes. There was the time he landed upside down in a swamp, and two kids out fishing had to cut him from his seatbelt. And the time he decided to give the crowd a thrill by doing the loop-the-loops without knowing how, the Jenny stalled and dropped from the sky like a stone. He regained control just seconds before he would have crashed. And then there was the afternoon he tried to impress the locals by taking off from their town's main street, a challenging plan considering the street's telephone poles were 48 feet apart and his plane's wingspan was 44 feet. All went well until one of his wheels hit a rut in the road, causing the plane to swing around and clip one of the poles with its wingtip. Out of control, the Jenny crashed through the front window of the hardware store. Miraculously, no one was hurt. Still, by September, Charles felt so confident in his skills that he invited Evangeline to join him. She quickly accepted. "I'd go with you no matter if my heart jumped out of my mouth," she declared.